Harlem in the late 1930s carried a rhythm that only those who lived within it could truly understand. A rhythm built on resilience, quiet endurance, and an unspoken agreement that survival often required more strength than anyone outside could ever imagine. The streets were alive with music, laughter, and ambition. But beneath that energy lay a constant awareness, a knowing that dignity, for some, was something that had to be defended every single day. And in the middle of that world stood Bumpy Johnson, a man whose presence did not demand attention, yet commanded respect in a way that felt almost effortless. He was not loud, not reckless, and never careless with his words. Bumpy carried himself with a calm that unsettled those who expected chaos, and a discipline that made others think twice before underestimating him. People didn't follow him out of fear. They listened because he understood something deeper than power. He understood balance. He understood restraint. And most importantly, he understood that respect, once lost, was not easily reclaimed. It had been weeks since the events, where a quiet confrontation had reshaped the way certain people viewed Harlem and the man who protected its dignity without ever raising his voice. That moment had traveled far beyond the streets. It had reached places where decisions were made in whispers and consequences were rarely visible. But while some had taken notice, others had taken offense. And offense, when mixed with arrogance, often turned into something far more dangerous. Bumpy's nephew, Elijah, was everything Harlem hoped its future could be. Young, ambitious, and sharp-minded, he carried himself with a confidence that wasn't rooted in arrogance, but in belief. He believed he could build something better not by running from where he came from, but by honoring it. Bumpy saw that in him, and though he rarely expressed emotion openly, there was a quiet pride in the way he spoke to Elijah, the way he listened to him, the way he allowed him to grow without interference. But Harlem had a way of testing hope. It started like any other day. The sun rose over the brownstones, the streets filled with familiar faces, and the city moved as if nothing unusual was waiting beneath the surface. Elijah had stepped out that morning with purpose, carrying plans, ideas, and a future that felt within reach. He greeted people along the way, exchanged words with shop owners, and moved with the kind of energy that made others smile without even realizing it. And then, somewhere between one street and the next, that energy disappeared. No one could say exactly when it happened. No one saw the moment clearly enough to explain it. But whispers began to form, quiet at first, uncertain, hesitant. A car, strangers, a confrontation that didn't last long but left behind something far heavier than noise. Absence. And absence, in a place like Harlem, was never ignored. By the time word reached Bumpy, the streets had already begun to shift. Conversations stopped when he passed. Eyes lowered, not out of guilt, but out of the kind of fear that comes from knowing something is wrong, but not knowing how to say it. Bumpy didn't rush. He didn't demand answers. He simply listened, and in that listening, he began to piece together a truth that no one wanted to fully acknowledge. This was not random. This was not a mistake. This was a message, and the message was meant for him. Dutch Schultz, a man who operated in a world where control was everything, had also heard the whispers. He understood conflict, understood territory, understood the consequences of stepping beyond invisible lines. But even he recognized that this situation carried a different weight. This was not about business or rivalry. This was something else entirely, something that, if handled wrong, could ignite a chain of events no one would be able to contain. When Dutch approached Bumpy, there was no tension between them, only a shared understanding that whatever had begun was not going to end quietly. "They want a reaction," Dutch said, his tone measured, almost cautious. Bumpy looked at him, his expression unchanged, his voice calm. "No," he replied. "They want a mistake." And that was the difference. Most men, when faced with loss, with anger, with injustice, reacted. They allowed emotion to lead, to dictate, to control. But Bumpy was not most men. He understood that the moment you lose control is the moment you lose everything. And whoever had done this, whoever had taken Elijah, was counting on exactly that. The next few days unfolded in a silence that felt almost unnatural. There were no public confrontations, no visible retaliation, no sudden shifts in power. But beneath that stillness, something was building. Bumpy moved through Harlem the same way he always had, but his presence carried a new gravity. He spoke to people, not to demand, but to understand. He listened, not just to words, but to what was left unsaid, and slowly the truth began to emerge. There were men who had come into Harlem who did not belong. Men who carried themselves with a kind of confidence that suggested they believed they were untouchable. They didn't hide. They didn't need to. Because their power didn't come from strength. It came from a system that allowed them to act without consequence. And that was the real danger. Not the act itself, but the belief that it would be ignored. By the third day, Harlem was no longer just watching, it was waiting. Waiting to see what Bumpy would do. Waiting to see if the man who had always carried himself with restraint would finally break that pattern. But Bumpy did not break, he adapted. He began visiting places he rarely visited. Speaking to people he rarely spoke to. Not with threats, not with anger, but with clarity. He didn't need to raise his voice because his words carried something far more powerful: truth. That could not be dismissed without consequence. This isn't about one person, he told a man who had the ability to influence decisions that were never made publicly. This is about what happens next if nothing changes. And that was when the weight of the situation began to shift. Because injustice, when ignored, does not stay contained. It spreads, it grows. It teaches people that silence is acceptable, that dignity is optional, that some lives are worth less than others. And once that belief takes hold, it becomes far more dangerous than any single act ever could. By the end of the third day, the city was no longer quiet in the same way. The silence had changed. It was no longer passive, it was tense. And tension, when it reaches a certain point, demands resolution. But the question remained, what would that resolution look like? And more importantly, would it come too late? And in Harlem, silence was never empty. It was always preparing for something. By the fourth day, Harlem no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a held breath that refused to release. The music still played in corners, footsteps still echoed across pavement, and storefronts still opened as they always had, but everything carried a quiet hesitation, as if the entire community understood that something irreversible was unfolding. Just beneath the surface, the absence of Elijah had grown heavier, no longer just a disappearance but a presence of its own, shaping conversations, altering routines, and forcing people to confront a truth they had learned over time to survive without speaking. But this time, the silence felt different. This time, it felt watched. Bumpy Johnson moved through this silence like a man who understood its language. He did not rush, did not gather crowds, did not speak in ways that would turn pain into spectacle. Instead, he became even more composed, more deliberate, as though every step he took had already been measured before his foot touched the ground. People expected anger from him, or at the very least, visible grief, but what they saw instead was something far more unsettling: control. Not the kind that denies emotion, but the kind that refuses to let emotion be used as a weapon against him. And those who had orchestrated this understood immediately that their plan, whatever it had been, was not unfolding the way they expected. The rumors, however, continued to grow. They spoke of outsiders, men who carried symbols of hatred, not just in their actions, but in the quiet confidence with which they moved. They did not belong to Harlem, yet they walked through it as though it owed them something. Their presence was not loud, but it was deliberate, calculated to be seen just enough to send a message without inviting direct confrontation. And the message was clear to those who understood it. This was not about one young man. This was about testing the limits of what Harlem would tolerate, and more importantly, what Bumpy Johnson would allow. Dutch Schultz watched from his own distance, his instincts sharpened by years of navigating power that rarely showed its full face. He had seen intimidation before, had used it, had survived it, but this was something else. There was no negotiation in this. No profit, no logic that fit within the usual boundaries of influence. When he approached Bumpy again, there was less certainty in his voice than before. "They're not looking for anything," Dutch said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "They're proving something." Bumpy stood still for a moment before responding, his gaze steady, almost distant, as though he was already several steps ahead in a game no one else could fully see. "No," he said softly. "They're hoping. No one proves them wrong." That distinction changed everything, because proving something wrong didn't require force. It required exposure, and Bumpy had already begun. Over the next 2 days, his movements became more intentional, though never dramatic. He visited places that existed beyond the street's offices, where decisions were made quietly, rooms where reputations were protected more fiercely than truth. He spoke to men who preferred to remain uninvolved, men who believed neutrality was a form of safety. But Bumpy did not accuse them, did not demand action. He simply told them what had happened. Not as a story, but as a reality that could no longer be ignored without consequence. "There's a difference," he said during one of those meetings, his voice calm but unwavering, "between not seeing something and choosing not to see it." And for the first time, some of those men realized they were no longer invisible to the situation. They were part of it. Meanwhile, Harlem continued to wait. Mothers held their children a little closer. Fathers spoke less and watched more. The elders, who had lived through cycles of injustice before, recognized the pattern. But they also recognized something else. This time, there was a shift, not in the threat, but in the response to it. Because Bumpy was not reacting the way history had taught them to expect. He was not allowing anger to create chaos. He was allowing truth to create pressure. By the 6th day, that pressure had reached places it was never meant to reach. The same men who had once walked through Harlem with quiet arrogance had begun to disappear from sight, not gone, just no longer visible. Their confidence, once so carefully displayed, had been replaced by something less certain. And the authorities, who had spent the past days maintaining distance, now found themselves unable to ignore the growing attention surrounding the situation. Questions were being asked, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently. And persistence, when guided by clarity, has a way of breaking through even the strongest walls of avoidance. Dutch noticed it first. "They're stepping back," he said, almost surprised, as if he hadn't expected the shift to happen without confrontation. Bumpy nodded slightly, his expression unchanged. "They're being seen," he replied. And that was the turning point, because what those men had relied on, what they had always relied on, was invisibility. The ability to act without consequence, to send messages without being held accountable for them. But Bumpy had taken that away, not with threats, not with force, but with something far more powerful, attention placed in the right direction. On the 7th day, the tension that had been building finally reached its peak, not in the streets, but in a room where silence had once been a shield. Bumpy entered without announcement, his presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere. The men inside, officials who had spent the past week carefully avoiding responsibility, now found themselves unable to do the same. There was no anger in Bumpy's posture, no aggression in his expression, only a calm certainty that made it clear he was not there to argue. He stood for a moment before speaking, allowing the weight of his presence to settle into the room. 7 days, he sighed quietly. No one responded. 7 days, he repeated, his voice steady, is how long it took for this to become normal. The words hung in the air, heavier than any accusation could have been. He took a step forward, not threatening, not forceful, just enough to make it clear that he was not leaving without being heard. If something can happen, he continued, and nothing changes, then the message isn't what was done. The message is what was allowed. There was no argument after that, no denial, no attempt to deflect. Because the truth, once spoken clearly enough, does not need to be defended. And in that moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The following hours did not bring celebration. They did not erase what had happened, but they brought movement, real movement. Actions that had been delayed were now unavoidable. People who had remained distant were now involved. And while no one spoke of it openly, everyone understood that something had changed, not because of force, but because of clarity that could no longer be ignored. Back in Harlem, the silence began to change once more. It was still quiet, still heavy, but no longer uncertain. Because for the first time in 7 days, it felt like something had finally been heard. And sometimes, being heard is where justice begins. The 8th day did not arrive with relief, it arrived with awareness. And awareness, once awakened, has a way of unsettling everything it touches. Harlem did not celebrate, did not rush into the streets with declarations of victory, because the people who lived there understood something deeper than momentary outcomes. They understood that justice was not defined by a single shift in behavior, but by whether that shift could endure when no one was watching. And for the first time in days, people began to feel that they were not just witnessing something, they were part of something that could not easily be undone. Bumpy Johnson, however, did not slow down. If anything, his movements became even more precise, as though he understood that the most fragile moment in any conflict is not the beginning, but the aftermath of the first response. Because once pressure is applied, there are always those who wait for it to fade, who believe that time will erase attention, that silence will return things to their previous state. But Bumpy was not interested in temporary shifts. He was interested in permanence, in ensuring that what had been exposed could not quietly retreat back into shadow. He spent that morning walking through Harlem with the same calm presence he had always carried, but there was something different, now not in him, but in how people saw him. Where there had once been quiet respect, there was now something deeper, something almost unspoken but widely understood. Trust. Not the kind built on fear or authority, but the kind that comes from watching someone stand firm without losing themselves in the process. Mothers who had once lowered their eyes now met his gaze. Elders who had seen decades of disappointment nodded to him with a subtle acknowledgement. And the younger generation, the ones who had grown up believing that silence was survival, began to question whether silence was the only option left to them. But beyond Harlem, something else was happening. The same attention that Bumpy had carefully directed had begun to ripple outward, reaching spaces that were not accustomed to scrutiny. Offices that had once operated comfortably within their own distance now found themselves under a quiet but persistent pressure. Questions, once avoidable, were now unavoidable, not because they were being shouted, but because they were being asked in the right places, in the right way, by people who could no longer pretend they hadn't heard them. Dutch Schultz observed all of this with a level of respect he rarely gave to anyone. He had built his understanding of power on leverage, on influence, on knowing when to push and when to retreat. But what Bumpy was doing did not fit into those rules. It was not force, not negotiation, not intimidation. It was something far more controlled and far more dangerous in its own way, because it didn't rely on fear to maintain itself. "You didn't end it," Dutch said one afternoon, watching Bumpy as he stood quietly outside a storefront, speaking with an elderly man who seemed more at ease than he had been in days. "You changed it." Bumpy didn't look at him right away. His attention remained on the conversation he had just finished, as if he understood that even the smallest interactions mattered now more than ever. When he finally turned, his expression was calm, thoughtful. "No," he said, "I showed it." Dutch frowned slightly, not out of disagreement, but out of realization. Because showing something, truly showing it, meant that it could no longer hide behind excuses, behind distance, behind the comfort of being unseen. And once something is seen clearly enough, it demands a response. But not everyone welcomed that response. By the 9th day, subtle resistance began to emerge, not in the streets, not in ways that could be easily identified, but in the spaces where influence quietly shifts direction. There were attempts to redirect attention, to minimize what had happened, to frame it as something isolated rather than something systemic. Conversations began to include phrases like misunderstanding and unfortunate incident, words designed not to clarify truth, but to soften it. Bumpy recognized it immediately. He had expected it. Because the moment truth becomes inconvenient, there are always those who will try to reshape it into something easier to accept. But Bumpy was prepared for that. He did not argue against those narratives publicly. He did not confront them directly. Instead, he continued doing what he had done from the beginning. He kept the focus where it belonged. He spoke to people who could not afford to ignore reality. He ensured that the story, the truth of what had happened, remained intact in the places where it mattered most. And most importantly, he refused to let the conversation move forward without acknowledging what had already occurred. "This isn't about how it's described," he said quietly during another meeting, his voice steady but firm. "It's about whether it's allowed again." That question lingered longer than any accusation could have, because it forced those listening to confront something they could not easily deflect responsibility. Back in Harlem, the change was becoming more visible, though still quiet in its nature. The same streets that had felt heavy with uncertainty now carried a different kind of energy, not relief, but resolve. People were not just waiting anymore. They were watching. And in that watching, there was a collective understanding forming, a realization that dignity, once defended, must continue to be upheld. And then, on the 10th day, something happened that no one had expected. Not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. A man who had been connected, however indirectly, to the events of the past week stepped forward, not publicly, not in front of crowds, but in a room where silence had once protected him. He spoke not out of fear, but out of something closer to realization. And while his words did not undo what had happened, they confirmed something that could no longer be dismissed or denied. The actions that had taken place were not accidental. They were intentional, and more importantly, they had been allowed. When that truth reached the right ears, the final barrier, the one built on plausible distance, began to crack. Dutch heard about it before most. "They're turning on each other now," he said, his tone carrying a mixture of surprise and respect. Bumpy nodded slightly, though there was no satisfaction in his expression. "They're facing themselves," he replied. And that was the final shift. Because conflict between people can be managed, controlled, even manipulated. But conflict within people, the kind that comes when they are forced to confront their own choices, that is something far harder to contain. By the end of the 10th day, the situation had moved beyond what it had originally been. It was no longer just about one act, one injustice, one message. It had become something broader, something deeper, a moment where the structures that allowed such things to happen were being examined. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that could not be easily dismissed. And through it all, Bumpy Johnson remained exactly who he had always been. Calm, measured, unshaken. Because he understood something that few others did, that true power is not about forcing change, but about making it impossible for things to remain the same. And as Harlem stood quietly, watching the final pieces fall into place, there was a sense, not of victory, but of something far more lasting. Recognition that dignity, once truly seen, cannot be unseen. It cannot. be denied. By the 11th day, Harlem no longer felt like a place waiting for an answer. It felt like a place that had already heard one, even if no one had spoken it out loud. The air had changed in a way that couldn't be explained through action alone. It wasn't louder, it wasn't brighter, and it certainly wasn't free from the weight of what had happened. But there was something else now, something steady, something grounded, a quiet restoration of dignity that did not demand attention, yet could be felt in every glance, every step, every breath taken without hesitation. Bumpy Johnson understood that this was the most important moment of all. Not the confrontation, not the tension, not even the turning point, but what came after. Because the aftermath of injustice is where its true impact is measured, not by what is said, but by what is allowed to continue. And Bumpy knew that if the city returned too quickly to its routine, if the memory of those days was softened or reshaped, then everything that had been revealed would slowly disappear into the same silence that had allowed it to happen in the first place. So he did something unexpected. He stepped back. Not out of retreat, not out of exhaustion, but out of understanding. Because what had been set in motion no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to Harlem, to the people who had felt it, who had witnessed it, who had carried its weight in ways that could never fully be explained. And for the first time in a long time, Harlem did not feel like it was waiting for someone else to speak on its behalf. It began with small things. A shopkeeper who refused to lower his gaze when confronted with quiet disrespect. A mother who spoke to her child not with fear, but with a renewed sense of pride. Young men who, instead of carrying anger, carried awareness and understanding that strength did not always require noise. These were not dramatic changes. They would not be written about in newspapers or discussed in rooms where influence was traded, but they mattered. Because they represented something deeper than reaction. They represented transformation. Dutch Schultz noticed it too, though he struggled to put it into words. He had spent his life observing shifts in power, reading situations before they fully developed, understanding how outcomes were shaped. But this was different. "This isn't how things usually end," he said one evening, standing beside Bumpy as the city moved quietly around them. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. His eyes followed the rhythm of Harlem, taking in the subtle changes, the quiet confidence that had replaced uncertainty. "That's because it didn't end," he said calmly. Dutch turned slightly, his brow tightening in thought. "It changed." And that was the truth of it. Because what had happened over those days had not been resolved in the way most conflicts are resolved. There had been no single moment of closure, no clear declaration that everything was now as it should be. Instead, there had been something far more powerful, a shift in understanding that could not be undone. But not everyone accepted that shift. There were still those who believed that time would erase what had happened, that people would forget, that the structures which had allowed such actions to occur would quietly rebuild themselves once attention faded. And in some places, those beliefs began to take form, subtle attempts to return things to what they had been, to re-establish the same patterns that had gone unquestioned for so long. Bumpy saw it, he always did. But this time, he did not intervene in the way he had before. Instead, he chose something far more deliberate. He allowed the silence to speak. Because now, that silence was no longer empty. It carried memory. It carried awareness. It carried the unmistakable presence of something that could not be ignored again without consequence. And when those attempts to revert back began to meet resistance, not loud, not aggressive, but firm and undeniable, it became clear that Harlem was no longer responding the way it once had. The people did not need to be told what was right. They had seen it, they had felt it. And once something like that takes root, it does not easily disappear. On the 12th day, the final piece fell into place. Not with an announcement, not with recognition, but with something far more meaningful. A quiet acknowledgement from those who had once remained distant. Decisions were made real ones, not performative, not temporary. Actions were taken that ensured what had happened could not simply be dismissed or repeated without consequence. And while no one stood in the streets declaring victory, there was a shared understanding that something important had been secured, not just for one moment, but for what would come after. Dutch, reflecting on everything he had witnessed, found himself seeing Bumpy differently than he ever had before. "You never forced it," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of sincerity. "You never pushed." Bumpy's expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. "If you force something," he replied, "it waits for a chance to return." Dutch nodded slowly, understanding settling in. "And this?" Bumpy looked out over Harlem, his gaze steady, unwavering. "This doesn't go back." That night, the city rested differently. Not because it was free from struggle, not because everything had been fixed, but because something had been proven. That dignity does not need to be loud to be powerful. That justice does not always arrive with noise. And that sometimes the strongest statement a person can make is to refuse to let silence mean acceptance. In the days that followed, life continued. People returned to their routines, conversations shifted, and the visible signs of what had happened began to fade, as they always do. But beneath it all, something remained, something quiet, something steady, something permanent. A memory, a lesson, a standard that had been set without force, without fear, without compromise. And Bumpy Johnson, as always, returned to his place within it, not above it, not separate from it, but as part of the same rhythm he had always understood, calm, composed, unshaken, because he knew something that few ever truly grasp, that real power is not in what you take, but in what you refuse to let be taken again. And in Harlem, that truth did not need to be spoken, because everyone could feel it. And that was enough.